Tomorrow, March 20th at 11:15 a.m. is the vernal equinox and the official beginning of spring. Meteorological spring began at the beginning of March, and we have already been very active, as usual for this time of year. Chris, Jeff, and I will talk about what winter was like and what we can expect for the spring in the southeast. We begin with Jeff addressing the climatology.
Okay, thank you, Todd. Here we have the past 30 days precipitation, and you see the two distinct areas there for the southeast. The past wet weather in the lower Mississippi Valley, shown in the red colors there, that has spilled over into the Tombigbee watershed and into Alabama and North Georgia, and the dryness for most of Florida, coastal Georgia, and the Carolinas. This shows up even better when we look at the departures, and we see with the lack of rain during a typically wet part of the year, as Todd mentioned, deficits are running 3 to 5 inches since mid-February in the orange colors there across parts of Alabama, Georgia, and Florida. Overall, most of the southeast has been dry, with the exception of the upper Tombigbee River watershed there in northeastern Mississippi. Looking at departures since the first of the year, we see the same pattern. Dry across southern Alabama, southern Georgia, and coastal South Carolina, as well as Florida, and wet in the northeast Mississippi area. And really, this is not that different than most La Nina winter and early spring periods. We see there on the right the typical areas that have increased risk of wetness or dryness for January through March. And we do see an increased risk from the middle lower Mississippi Valley into the Ohio River Valley and into the eastern Great Lakes region there with La Nina. When we look at the precipitation since the beginning of the year with our La Nina conditions right now, we see much of the same pattern or axis. Not exactly, but similar. Note the dryness there in Florida that is typical, and the dryness we are seeing today. So typically this time of year, we're also at our peak river flood period. In most years, we see about a dozen river gauges across our area and flood this time of year. The map at the top shows there from Georgia to the Carolinas, flooding is pretty typical this time of year. This year with the La Nina, we see this is not so much the case. We really have not seen the significant spring rain systems we tend to see in the late winter and spring, and most of these have actually tracked farther north. And that is why we see this map, no locations currently in the flood. Storm systems have been, again, generally lighter and less frequent. And so flood hazards have been limited, but drought impacts are beginning to increase. Here we see the past 28-day average stream flow and lots of oranges and reds there from Florida, the Florida Panhandle through the Carolinas and into Virginia, meaning stream flows are running below to well below normal. And this time of year, they are generally peaking. So this does not bode well going into the warmer months. And with that being said, we see drought expanding across the southeast with moderate drought now across a quarter of the area and nearly half of the area in abnormally dry conditions there in the yellow. What will we see in the short term, and what will we see in the long term that may help or worsen these conditions? Chris and Todd will address these questions here now.
We're beginning the period in the midst of an active pattern with two low-pressure systems impacting the area in the short-term period. These systems will move eastward during the period, leaving most of the area under high pressure by the end of the short term. During the midterm period this weekend, the area of high pressure will shift eastward and out of the area, which is expected to open up the area to receive additional precipitation. We shouldn't focus on the exact location of fronts this far out, but models are indicating a return to active weather. Here is the current 7-day precipitation forecast. Much of this precipitation is in the short-term period associated with those two lows moving through. The long-term outlook calls for above normal precipitation amounts through much of the area. This is primarily based on the indication from models that high pressure will have moved out of the area by the early part of the long-term period, allowing for a more active pattern again.
Thank you, Chris, for the meteorology, and now we'll head towards the long term. And The first thing we'll look at is the most recent ENSO forecast, and while it does come from February, I suspect the March outlook will look very similar. We are transitioning from La Nina to neutral conditions in the Pacific Ocean. Our spring and summer will likely remain in neutral conditions, with fall looking more interesting with possible El Nino conditions. It's way too early to tell what that time frame will bring us, and so we will talk about it more when we get a little bit closer. Jeff spoke to you about the 90 days of rainfall. or 90 days, or since the beginning of the year. I'm going to address it, but also with a slant towards what to expect in the future. Here's the winter temperatures departure from normal, and this goes from December through the end of February. And as you can see, most of the southeast was above normal. This was well predicted by the Climate Prediction Center. Even though we had a pretty chilly January, overall it was a warm winter. It was also drier than normal winter over most of the southeast. The white area indicates precipitation within 25% of normal on either side. The brown area in parts of the southeast show below normal, and these are the areas that are showing up in D0 and as much as D2 in some spots on the drought monitor. As a continuation of the winter, the temperature forecast for April is for above normal. You will see this as a running theme in the southeast, in that nearly all of our forecasts through the rest of the year suggest above normal temperatures. Continued below normal rainfall over Florida and up and near the Atlantic coast for the month of April. With a smaller area creeping east along the Florida coast, there is still a better than normal chance for above normal rainfall at the top of the Tombigbee Basin. The rest of the southeast is in between, with equal chances for above, near, and below normal precipitation. Our seasonal forecast, April through June, shows above normal temperatures over all of the southeast. Since this has been a pattern I have been showing, I'll talk about a little bit more about it. The above normal temperatures do have an impact on moisture and stream flows in the southeast, and while it is not as important as the rainfall component, can play a big role by higher evaporation from lakes, vegetation needing more of the soil moisture to survive, and quicker drying of the top layer of the ground, meaning we need more rainfall for runoff to make it to the rivers and lakes. Because we are moving from La Nina to neutral conditions, the models don't have a clear indication on which way the precipitation forecast will go, so smaller scale factors will likely push us one way or another, and those become much more difficult to predict as we get out to a seasonal time frame. And finally, I'll show the July through September forecast. It remains warm across the southeast and across most of the country, while precipitation trends are similar to our April through June forecast. The exception being the above normal possibilities in North Carolina and Virginia, as the models hint at wetness along the northeastern seaboard that stretches down that far south. And so the bottom line, in the short term, spring is here, and recharge or flood season is winding down for most of the southeast. Next month we'll begin the talk about the wet season down in Florida, but for the time being, they're still kind of in their dry season. And as for the long term, looks like normal rainfall for the foreseeable future. We do look to, at least for April, seem to be below normal, especially in that Florida time frame. But as we get a little further out, we get more normal, and we'll see if we have a normal wet season for them to try and bring them out of some of the drought areas that have been created in the last couple of months. And we'll talk about that during our next Water Resources Outlook, which we plan to record on April 19th, 2018.